The ring came home on a soft November evening. Elizabeth walked through the front door holding her hand high so the diamond scattered lamplight across the marble foyer. Her father and I carried her across the day we brought her home from the hospital. I was in the kitchen polishing the silver we only used for Christmas, the same scarred pine table where she once did homework while I stirred soup. I set the cloth down, wiped my hands on the apron she used to twirl in, and opened my arms. She let me hold her for exactly one heartbeat. Then she stepped back and the distance began. His name was Charles. Old textile fortune, new entitlement. His mother wore dove-gray silk and spoke of the estate sale after the wedding before she ever asked how I took my tea. That evening we sat in the west parlor where the grandfather clock still measured every important moment we ever had. Elizabeth spread glossy plans across the mahogany table, new marble for the master bath, French doors replaced with glass, the library turned into a wellness suite. I touched one rendering gently. "Will there still be room for your father's books?" I asked. She smiled the way you smile at someone who has suggested keeping a rotary phone in a smart house. "Mom, the mansion needs to feel current. Charles's family has ideas." I poured tea that went cold. I watched her fingers trace lines over walls that had held her childhood drawings and felt the first small room being taken from me. The weeks that followed were quiet redecorating. Painters arrived unannounced. Furniture was measured for removal. Texts that ended with "Don't worry, we'll store your things" instead of "love." I told myself it was normal. Brides dream in new colors. Mothers learn to live with fewer rooms. That is the silent bargain we make when we first hear their cry. One Sunday in December she came alone. She sat on the edge of the velvet settee, knees together, hands folded the way she used to when she had broken something priceless. "Mom," she said, studying the Persian rug instead of me, "Charles and I need the house to feel like ours before the wedding. I need space from you. I can't breathe with you in every corner." I waited. The clock ticked. She finally looked up. "I think you should stay somewhere else until after the honeymoon." I remember tasting iron in my mouth. I remember smiling the small, harmless smile widows perfect over years of practice. "Of course, darling," I said. And the first lock in my heart turned with a soft, final click. January arrived cold and careless. The snow fell against the tall windows the same way it had the winter Elizabeth learned to walk holding my fingers across the parquet floor. I watched it from the same wing chair where I once read her fairy tales until she fell asleep against my shoulder. The changes began as gentle suggestions. Then they became announcements. "The East Wing will be Charles's study. Your things can go in storage. The Rose bedroom needs new drapes. We're donating yours. The kitchen island is too small. We're ripping it out next month." Each sentence landed like a small hammer tapping nails into walls that had never belonged to anyone but me. In February came the decorators, 3 young women in black carrying tablets and measuring tapes. They moved through the house like quiet ghosts, photographing every corner, marking walls with blue tape. Elizabeth walked beside them, pointing, deciding, erasing. I stood in the doorway of what had been her nursery and watched them measure for a walk-in closet. When she saw me, her smile faltered for half a heartbeat. Then it returned, practiced. "Mom, we're just planning. Nothing is happening until after the wedding." I said I understood. They kept measuring. The blue tape looked like scars. One gray afternoon I walked the long hallway alone. The portraits of my husband's grandparents stared down with the same quiet eyes they had watched Elizabeth take her first steps beneath. I touched each frame and felt the house breathe around me, wounded but still alive. That night I sat in the library with the lights off. I ran my hands over the leather-bound books Charles wanted gone and felt the years of bedtime stories and rainy afternoons fold themselves into a very small, very heavy place inside my chest. I made tea I did not drink. I looked at the photographs on the mantel, Elizabeth in pigtails chasing fireflies, Elizabeth in a graduation cap, Elizabeth asleep on my lap the night her father died. And somewhere between the second and third photograph I stopped waiting to be asked to stay. March came in hard and white. One evening I went to the attic to find the box of Elizabeth's childhood drawings I had promised the wedding planner could be scanned for a memory table. Behind the cedar trunk, wrapped in the same cream cashmere shawl I wore the day she was born, lay the small mahogany box my husband pressed into my hands the night before the cancer took him. I carried it downstairs and laid it on the kitchen table beneath the lamp we had used for report cards and hospital bills and every hard truth we ever faced together. The little silver key still hung on its ribbon beneath my blouse. I had worn it for 21 years without knowing why it felt heavier some days. The lid opened with a soft, patient sigh, as though it had been holding its breath. Inside were bank folders, share certificates, and one thick cream document sealed with burgundy wax. I broke the seal. The deed to the entire estate, 22 rooms, 12 acres, every brick and beam, signed over to me alone in 1981, the year we moved in. Never transferred. Never amended. Never mentioned to anyone after he was gone. At the bottom, in his careful architect's hand, if anyone ever asks you for space inside the house you carried our child through, give them all of it. Change the locks and let the silence teach them whose walls these truly are. Beneath the deed lay a single photograph of the mansion at twilight, the master bedroom window circled in faded blue ink and the words, "For Eleanor. Always yours. Never theirs unless you say so." I read until moonlight laid silver across the table and the blue decorator's tape still clinging to the hallway door frame. Then I read again by lamplight while the snow tapped the window like small, patient fingers asking to be let in from the cold. I closed the box, laid my palm on the warm mahogany, and felt the house settle around me like an old friend who had simply been waiting for me to remember I still held the only key. That night I began moving possessions the way moonlight moves across still water, slowly, silently, leaving no wake. I kept the original deed on the table beneath a vase of white camellias that opened and closed with no one to see. Some nights I walked every corridor touching the walls he designed himself. I left every light burning because darkness felt too much like surrender. The silver key now hung openly against my heart like a second, steadier pulse. And every morning I laid the deed beside my teacup and watched the light move across the marble watermark that had never belonged to Charles's family at all. I was no longer waiting to be moved out. I was simply preparing the silence she had asked for. April arrived soft and treacherous. I rose before the sun, made coffee I barely tasted, and opened the mahogany box each morning like a quiet vow. I laid the deed in the center of the kitchen table, weighted with the same silver tray that had held Elizabeth's christening cup. I telephoned the estate locksmith from the village library on Thursdays when Elizabeth thought I was at the garden club. I used the polite, slightly confused voice of a widow who just wants to be sure the old locks are still safe. They told me everything: master key schedules, electronic deadbolt codes, the private service entrance that only answered to the owner's thumbprint. I wrote every detail in a small ivory journal, the color of the dress she had chosen for me so I would fade into the photographs. Page by page the journal filled with quiet thunder. At night I changed locks the way moonlight changes across parquet floors, slowly, completely, unseen. Never enough to raise an alarm, always enough to matter when the final key refused to turn. By May every exterior door, every garden gate, even the wine cellar hatch answered only to the new codes I entered the day Elizabeth took her first steps across the foyer. Elizabeth came once in June. She swept in wearing linen and new certainty, carrying paint swatches and furniture catalogs. She spread them across the kitchen table without seeing the deed beneath the silver tray. I poured tea she did not drink. She looked up and noticed the ivory journal. Her smile thinned. Mom, you're not still writing things down, are you? The planner has everything. I stirred my tea once, twice. Just remembering, I said. She laughed the way you laugh at someone who still keeps keys on a ribbon. Then she gathered her catalogs and left without noticing the camellias had been changed to white, the exact shade of the walls she would never repaint. That evening I stood before the grand hallway mirror and practiced the small, pleasant smile that made locksmiths and estate managers tell me their secrets. I practiced walking the corridors in the ivory silk dress I would wear on the day. I practiced carrying the weight of what was coming without letting it show in my shoulders. July came warm and final. The last moving boxes arrived, labeled in her careful handwriting, master bedroom, wellness suite, his study. I signed for them, thanked the driver, and stacked them neatly in the carriage house she had never noticed I still controlled. Some evenings I sat on the terrace with tea that steamed only for me and listened to the garden prepare itself for perfect silence. I was ready. Not angry. Simply ready the way dusk is ready long before the first star appears. It was a Tuesday in early August, the kind of golden morning that makes every window in the mansion glow like warm honey. I was at the kitchen table arranging the last of the white camellias when the telephone rang once. Elizabeth's voice was bright, almost relieved. Mom, I need to be honest. I need real space from you before the wedding. It's only 6 weeks, but I can't breathe with you in the house. I've arranged for you to stay at the inn in town until after the honeymoon. The movers come tomorrow for your things. I listened to the small pause where she waited for me to protest. I looked out the window at the rose garden sleeping under full summer. I looked at the ivory journal lying open to the page that listed every new lock code. I said only, I understand, darling. Space is important. She exhaled so deeply I heard it across the line. Thank you, Mom. I knew you'd be reasonable. She hung up before I could wish her good night. I set the receiver down gently. I finished arranging the camellias into a perfect circle, the way I once arranged her hair ribbons when she was small. Then I walked upstairs, opened the wardrobe, and took out the ivory silk dress she had chosen for me months earlier. I laid it across the bed and looked at it for a long time. Afterward I went to the library and sat in the leather chair her father used to read to her from. I took the silver key from around my neck, opened the mahogany box, and removed the original deed. I held it in both hands and felt the thick paper warm as living skin. I made one telephone call. To the estate manager whose private number was written on the deed's final page. He answered on the first ring. I said only, execute full owner resecuring protocol, effective this evening. No exceptions. He replied, yes, Mrs. Ashford. The house will recognize only you by sunset. I hung up. I walked every corridor once more, touching the walls, the banisters, the cool marble of the foyer where she learned to walk. I left every light burning. Then I packed one small overnight case, slipped the deed into the ivory clutch, and drove away before the sun reached the west turret. The mansion stood quiet behind me, waiting. I did not look back. I had given her all the space she asked for, every room, every hallway, every breath the house had ever held. I was not angry. I was simply absent the way summer is absent of snow, clean, complete, and impossible to argue with. The wedding morning arrived pale and perfect. 200 guests drifted across the south lawn beneath white tents that fluttered like surrendered flags. The string quartet played softly. The roses were heavy with scent. I watched from the master balcony of the east wing, ivory silk catching the breeze, a single cup of tea cooling in my hand. At 10 o'clock the moving trucks appeared, 3 white vans labeled Ashford Pierce Relocation, Elizabeth's new married name already painted on the side. They parked at the service gate. Men in gray uniforms began unloading boxes marked Master Suite, Wellness Wing, his study. Elizabeth arrived in clouds of lace, veil floating, smile perfect. She stepped out of the white rolls, turned toward the front doors, and lifted the old brass key she had copied years ago. It slid into the lock and stopped. She tried again. Nothing. Charles tried his copy. Nothing. His mother tried the electronic pad with the code she had chosen. Red light. Denied. The movers waited. Guests began to notice. A hush moved across the lawn like wind through tall grass. Elizabeth looked up. Our eyes met across the marble balustrade. Her veil trembled. I lifted my teacup in the smallest salute and stepped back inside. The French doors closed with the softest click. Every lock in the house engaged at once. Below, voices rose. Phones appeared. The estate manager arrived, hands folded, expression perfectly neutral. Mrs. Ashford has executed full owner resecuring. The property recognizes only her signature today. Elizabeth's bouquet slipped from her fingers and struck the top step. White petals scattered across the stone like small apologies that would never be spoken. The ceremony was moved to the tent. Vows were spoken beneath rented chandeliers. The reception carried on with rented furniture and borrowed silver. But every guest remembers the moment the bride stood locked outside her own future. I slept that night in the bedroom where I once rocked her through nightmares. The house was very quiet. It sounded like forgiveness. They say the photographs are lovely, Elizabeth radiant, Charles proud, the lawn glowing. But every picture is taken against the backdrop of a mansion whose windows stayed dark and watchful. She came to the house one October evening when the first leaves had begun to fall. She stood on the front steps in boots and the same sweater she wore at 16 and asked if the East Wing still smelled of her father's books. I made tea. We sat at the kitchen table where every important plan had once been made. She cried without sound. I passed tissues the way I once passed warm milk at 2 in the morning. When the cup was empty she whispered, I thought it would be mine. I looked at her for a long, steady moment. It was mine to give, I said. You simply forgot to ask. She left the sweater draped over the chair. I hung it in the cedar closet beside the ivory dress that now lives in light instead of shadow. Some evenings I walk the corridors alone. The portraits watch with quiet approval. I pause in every room she tried to take and feel the walls breathe with me. The house is silent, the way very old houses become silent when they remember who they truly belong to. People ask if I am lonely. I tell them loneliness is 22 rooms filled with someone else's future. I have the entire mansion. That is surprisingly peaceful. The last laugh is never loud. It is the soft click of a lock that knows its true name. It is the quiet closing of French doors on a day that believed it had sent the owner away. It is an old woman walking her own marble floors in ivory silk, listening to the grandfather clock say welcome home again and again, knowing every room still carries her heartbeat whether anyone else hears it or not. If this story settled gently somewhere inside you tonight, stay a while longer. The kettle is warm, the East Wing is quiet, and there are many more evenings when a woman remembers she was always the house, never the guest they tried to move out. You are safe here. You are seen. And that, my dear, is the only deed that truly matters.